dernière conférence de ce matin. C'est Johan Bollen qui va nous parler de Toxic Data et je laisse mon collègue et ami Reda Benguerir présenter Johan pendant que Johan arrive.
Yes, Johan Bollen is a psychologist. He did his PhD at the Free University of Brussels. This place is a very important place regarding the studies of complexity, emergence, nonlinearity, because this school was founded by Ilya Prigozhin, who was a Nobel Prize, and Johan Bollen was a student of Luc Steele's, a thinker of artificial intelligence, who did a brilliant presentation yesterday, and he was also, his thesis was done with Francis Eiligen, the cybernetician from the same university that will be here tomorrow on a session on self-organization and emergence. So what is very interesting with Johan Bollen, he has also worked for the Los Alamos National Laboratory in the US. He's professor at Indiana University. He has also participated to a very interesting documentary film done by the Santa Fe Institute titled Solutions. We here focus more on wicked problems, but I suggest that this documentary film is available on the web, and it's very interesting exercise. And Johan Bollen is also, I think his talk will be listened by the young students, because he's proposing, we mentioned the notion of precautionary principle. So regarding the digital network, the social or unsocial network, he will talk about the potential dangers of this new environment. Thank you very much. You have the floor.
Okay, great. Let me advance the slides. I want to apologize in advance because I think this is the previous presentations were very uplifting, very optimistic, very happy, nice messages, poetry, etc. And I have something to offer that is a little darker, I think, but equally relevant, I hope, to this audience. So the title of my talk is a little bit of a play of words with one of the other presenters who published a book on toxic data, and so I figured to call the presentation Toxic Networks, because I think that's more or less, that's a pretty good summary of the environment that we find ourselves in right now. We live in a world of complex systems. Very often these systems are amenable to be modeled by complex networks. Complex networks are a fantastic mathematical device by which we can study the topology and the structure of these complex systems, which essentially consist of large numbers of entities that interact in a non-trivial manner. Now, the complex networks are generally distinguished by a number of characteristics which are not trivial at all. For example, a heavy tail in the degree distribution, which generally could be interpreted as saying that some nodes in the network have very few have very many connections, and most nodes have very few connections. So there's a strong inequality of connectedness in these networks. A high clustering coefficient, meaning that nodes tend to cluster together in tightly packed assemblies. There could be a strong sense of assortativity or disassortativity among the vertices, which means that the vertices that have similar features tend to cluster together. We see this in social networks, for example, where people prefer to connect to other people that are like them in terms of religion, race, sex, etc. Community structure and hierarchical structures. These networks are everywhere, and I think the study of these networks has gotten a big boost in the past 20 years because of the emergence of the internet, which in many ways could be considered a complex network of both people and machines connected across geographic, linguistic boundaries. For anyone interested in sort of this still evolving science of networks or network science, I highly recommend Barabashi's book on network science, which provides a really a fabulous introduction to this domain. Now, I will say I started working with Francis Heilingen as his doctoral student in the early 90s when Francis's project, the Principia Cybernetica, had just created the first Belgian website. So that's a little bit of a claim to fame, you know, world famous in Belgium, as they say. And we were really smitten by this technology because it became obvious to us that this was going to be a technology that was going to connect potentially billions of individuals across geographical, linguistic, cultural boundaries. And very soon we started to look at sort of the future of this kind of a network as something that would unleash the potential of humanity, right? In terms of creating almost like a global brain where each of us individually would be a neuron, and the axons that connect us would be provided by the internet. So we'd have a giant network that we were conceiving of as a global brain. And I'm referring to a paper here by Simon Dedeo, which has done quite a bit of research in showing that some of the phenomena that we see, the collective phenomena, the behavior that we're seeing in these kind of networks do actually represent a form of computation that is quite non-trivial. To some degree, sort of this was a utopian view of this future of the internet, the future of society that would make use of the internet. We were thinking about sort of something that would liberate humanity and de-intermediate societies, meaning that existing structures which mediated between the individual and a variety of institutions and social goods, that they would disappear. And there would be a very direct form of communication and access to information, but also to goods, which to a degree has happened. But over the past 10 or 15 years, I have to be honest, I've been thinking of revisiting that utopian vision a little bit. What we've seen over the past 10 or 15 years is sort of a de-intermediation. If you look at, for example, the internet right now, you know, about 60% of the world's population has access to the internet, uses the internet. About 60% of the entire world, about 5 billion people, uses some social media platform. In fact, 57% of network traffic right now is caused by big tech. Google, Netflix, Facebook, Apple, Amazon, Microsoft, just a few companies that are essentially causing the overwhelming majority of network traffic on the internet, meaning that the internet was, you know, has been very, sort of the flow of information has been very strongly concentrated in the hands of a few corporate entities. And so over the past 10 years, again, we've seen some phenomena that are very worrisome. Instead of sort of a wisdom of the crowd effect, sort of this global brain that would lead to the emergence of an intelligence that would allow us to solve these really complex problems, what we've seen is somewhat of the opposite, the sort of Charles Mackay vision of the madness of the crowd. You know, we've seen a spread of misinformation, polarization, widespread distraction, extremism, ethical challenges, and also implications for the mental health. And I'll go into that a little bit because I think that social media and the internet is actually implicated in some of the recent phenomena that we are observing in our youth. If you're interested in reading something really interesting about sort of a criticism of social media and its widespread use in our population, please read Jaron Lanier's book, 10 Arguments for Deleting Your Social Media Accounts Right Now. It's a very short and sweet read, and also very informative by someone, a true visionary who really understands these environments better than many of us do. But here's something I wanted to point out, and it's, you know, I'm looking at this from the side, but here's something. These are statistics about American youth, and you know, I grew up in the 80s and 90s. You know, this is the height of the summer of love, the emergence of acid house, the raves. You know, it was a pretty wild time, good times. You know, today's youth is much nicer than we were. They use less drugs, they smoke less cigarettes. They have less sex, they watch television less. So when it comes to sort of the vices that characterized, if I can say that, my generation and how we spend our youth, today's youth are good. They're not naughty, they're nice. But at the same time, if you look at the graphs at the bottom, this is based on the Youth Risk Behavior Survey, you can see that has not led to increases in well-being. I mean, these are disastrous statistics. I mean, I cannot stress this enough. I mean, if you look at recent data, you could see that about 1/3 of teenage girls right now reports having either contemplated or effectively planned suicide. I mean, the mental health of our youth is in a very precarious situation. And the one thing that is remarkable about this generation is that although they are very nice in terms of their sexual behavior, their alcohol consumption, their drug consumption, etc., the one thing that distinguishes them is the prevalence of the use of smartphones, tablets, particularly the use of mobile devices on which they access social media. And so it's natural to think that perhaps the internet and social media environments are actually implicated in this odd paradox that we observe. And when it comes to what we've seen in the past couple of years with the COVID-19 pandemic, of course, that has done no good. You know, these lockdowns have been quite disastrous for our mental health. And as you can see from these statistics, again, these are US adults. So they're in a little better shape than US youth. But as you can see, 11% seriously considered suicide, 31% exhibits the symptoms of anxiety and depression, which are very debilitating disorders. And those are the adults. But for the youth, the challenges are even more significant. And I cannot stress how disastrous these reports are. They reveal a truth about our youth that we have to face and that we have to understand the reasons for. Anyway, so the thing is that if you look at the numbers, I don't know whether I can go back to the previous slides. So more than 40% of high school students in the United States are feeling so sad and hopeless that they cannot engage in regular activities. If you compare that with sort of the overall prevalence of, for example, anxiety and depression, which is the leading contributor to the burden of disability worldwide, according to the WHO. The lifetime prevalence of depression is 16.2% across the population, depends on gender, etc. But as you can see, this is much better than what we're finding for our youth right now. Again, the same people who use drugs less, drink less alcohol, smoke less, have sex less, watch television less, but are very heavy social media users. And so this made me think a little bit of a paradox that we might observe here. So, social media use is nearly universal among not just among the youth population, but also among young adults in our youth. These lockdowns, the social isolation that marked them, led to more social media use. But social media use, don't forget, is specifically geared towards connecting people, to form social connections. We see all of the tokens of, of social connectedness. Friends, follows, likes, etc. These are all sort of, simulations of social connections that we as a social species really crave and need for our well-being. And so, but here's the paradox then. You have so many people using social media, which means they can establish many social connections, many more than used to be possible, but at the same time we seem to have a disastrous effect on well-being. And I don't think it's still up in the air somewhat. There's been quite a bit of research, even controlled experiments with people who were effectively paid to not use social media for a month, and where we saw increases in their well-being. And there's been quite a bit of sort of survey studies that show that overall time spent on social media is strongly associated with internalizing disorders such as anxiety and depression and lowered well-being. So this is sort of a paradox, if you will. Social media helps us to make connections. As a social species, we need connections, but then it seems to be associated with lowered well-being. And so there's really been accumulating evidence of the role of social media and social networking in lowering well-being and the prevalence of internalizing disorders such as depression and anxiety. So that's a very dark picture. So, but what's going on here? How could we possibly understand this? So, if you look at these social networks, they're really interacting with people whose behavior, affect, and cognition is very strongly interrelated. It's a complex system where our cognition, our cognitive state affects our affect and our behavior, but our behavior affects our cognition and our affective state, and vice versa. And so how could potentially social networks intervene in that system? And so that's the challenge. I mean, this requires models that account for the complex interactions between these factors in in the context of social networks. Fortunately, though, the same social networks and social media that might be implicated in this rather dark trend are also furnishing the kind of data that might allow us to get a bit better picture of what's going on. And so my team and I have been, for the past decade, have focused on analyzing social media data to conduct what we would label computational social science, namely that we attempt to track the mental health status of millions of individuals from their social media activities, from the social media content that they post longitudinally over time, to see whether we can learn something about what's happening in these social networks that might, again, be implicated in these decreases of well-being that we're finding. Okay, so I'll present a few vignettes, a few results of or outcomes of this research. So, network effects of social media use and well-being, and this is again goes towards another one of those paradoxes which has been very well known in social network analytics. So, first, here's an analysis that we've done, and again, think of the kind of experiments that psychologists usually conduct over like 20 or 30 people, or perhaps a couple of hundred people at the most. Here we're talking about like tens of million people, or in some of our research, hundreds of millions of people. So this is based on a data set that we obtained in 2008, 2009, quite a while ago, for 5 million users, and we collected about 130 million of their tweets. And then retrieved their follow relationships. And we made a very basic assumption here, namely that if I follow you, you follow me back, then it's likely that we have some form of social relationship. I know that it's a little bit of a reduction, and social relationships are much more complex, but from the data, that's what we could gather. So if we have a reciprocal follow relation, we presume there's some social relationship between the two individuals, which means that for those 5 million users, we could essentially construct a social network. And there's a sample of the network shown on the right-hand side that is clearly indicative of the things that you would expect from a complex network. So high clustering degree, very skewed degree distributions, etc. Now, the next thing that we did, for each of the individuals in that network, for each of those 5 million individuals, we downloaded their timeline, all of the tweets that they had posted up to that point in time. And then we subjected those tweets to a natural language processing technique called sentiment analysis. These are algorithms that essentially read text and then score them or grade them in terms of the affect that they express, the sort of semantic polarity, whether they're positive or negative tweets. That allowed us, for each of those 5 million individuals, to determine from the set of tweets that we downloaded whether overall they post tweets that were indicative of a positive or a negative affective state. Anyway, I won't go into the mathematics of this. And so here's what we found. And these are pretty surprising results, because it shows that mood is assortative in these social networks. That means that people who post a lot of happy tweets and are presumably happy themselves prefer to connect to other happy individuals. Right? So that's not quite so surprising, but what's really surprising is the very strong connection between people who overall post very negative content. And I can give you some examples, but these are very negative users that they post tweets that are indicative of serious affective issues. And these individuals tend to also connect predominantly to people with a similar negative mood state as themselves. So it's like misery loves company. So if you're miserable and you connect to people on Twitter, you're more likely to connect to other miserable people. If you're happy, you're more likely to connect to other happy people. So, that's interesting, of course, because that means that that we choose our own social environments on these social media platforms in a way that might be not conducive to our well-being. So that's part of the puzzle, I think. But here's something else that is a known phenomenon in social networks, namely the friendship paradox. The friendship paradox, in a few words, is the finding that your friends, on average, have more friends than you do. Hashtag for real. And so it's a paradox, right? So this is a little bit like Lake Woebegone, where all of the kids are above average, So how is that possible? How is it possible that in social networks, your friends, on average, have more friends than you do? sounds like a paradox. Well, the reason for that is these very skewed degree distributions. And so there's an example at the bottom of this slide where if you look at the blue circle, that, let's just say that's an individual, that individual has 6 connections. So this is a very popular, this is one of these popular kids in school, right? While the other nodes, the red nodes have 2 or 3 connections, much fewer, right? So if each of those nodes, which is connected to the node in the blue, looks at the average connectedness of the average number of friends of their friends, that average will be higher than their own number of friends. So their friends on average will be more popular than they are. Why? Because of these very skewed degree distributions. Make sense? It's not really a paradox once you look at it, but it is a sort of a counterintuitive finding. So, okay, so, well, how about that happiness? How about that happiness assortativity we discovered where happy Twitter users connect to other happy Twitter users and unhappy Twitter users connect to other unhappy Twitter users. Well, how does that work then? Well, how does that interact? Well, if happiness and popularity are correlated, any feature correlated with popularity, right, which is distributed in a very skewed manner, will also be more prevalent in the neighbors of these nodes, right? So if in these social networks, your friends on average are more popular than you are, if popularity and happiness are associated, that means that your friends on average will also be happier than you are. Make sense? Okay, so is that actually the case? Well, let's see whether, in addition to a friendship paradox, we also find a happiness paradox. And again, this is contingent on on popularity and happiness being correlated. Okay, so let's look at it. First of all, this is the Twitter network that we just talked about. We find a very strong popularity or friendship paradox. Again, your friends on average are much more popular than you are because there's a bunch of, well, a few very popular individuals and they skew these distributions for all of us. And this is an effect that we all experience when we go in these social networks. We look around and these very popular individuals, they kind of ruin it for all of us. Right, because they skew our perception of how popular people are in general. So for both the happy and for both groups, the happy people connected to happy people, unhappy people connected to unhappy people, we find a very strong popularity paradox. So that's bad news. But the worst news is that we also find a happiness paradox. And what that means is that the global picture here is that if you're miserable, you're unhappy, you're quite likely to connect to other unhappy users on Twitter. But those unhappy users on Twitter that you connect to, on average, will still be more popular and happier than you are. So this is almost unavoidable in these social networks. So you can easily see if you're not a very happy disposition, and you go in these social networks, you'll be connected to people who are certainly equally miserable as you are, but on average they will seem more popular and still happier than you are. So that's not a good situation at all, if you think about it, right? So this shows that with this kind of large-scale analysis of both the social relationships that we maintain on these social media platforms and some smart natural language processing, we can learn something quite fundamental about how these online social networks might actually induce the kind of effects that we talk about. I mean, this is almost impossible to avoid because all social networks that we know have these very skewed degree distributions, have these very skewed distributions of popularity. Right? And with these effects, these homophilic effects, we will find these very strong happiness and popularity paradoxes. So that's not great. But again, the unhappy group is worse off compared to the overall population, which is really bad. So this led us to, of course, this is sort of a statistical, this is an association that we can determine, but we're also quite interested in modeling the dynamics of human emotions at much smaller, much tighter scales than we had been capable of doing before. Now, measuring fluctuations in human affective states is really difficult because it's introspective. You essentially have to ask people how they feel. And you can't ask them how they feel too often. right? Because otherwise the question itself will warp people's mood states. I mean, if someone would ask me every 5 minutes how I'm feeling, I would get really cranky. And so it would affect my mood state, and the measurement might become relatively invalid. So this is a typical conundrum in the social sciences and in psychology. Also, these introspective self-reports, you know, they suffer a little bit from social conformity. If you ask an American how they're doing, they're always doing great. Right? So, but that's not a very reliable measurement of their emotional state. That's just a social expectation. So we attempted to actually leverage the same data that I showed you, well, the same Twitter data, to see whether we can actually measure the dynamics of naturally occurring emotions and actually follow how an individual emotional state fluctuates over time. And so what we did is the following. So let's see, I'm just going to skip through these slides. So we did the following. So we looked for tweets where someone said, "I feel," and then a description of how they feel. Like, I feel good, I feel happy, I feel sad, I feel terrible, I feel awesome. So we looked for positive and negative adjectives or adverbs that followed the I feel statement. So that allowed us to split these individuals into two cohorts, two groups. People that said that they were feeling good, people that said that they were feeling bad, so they were having a positive or a negative emotion. And then we looked at the tweets posted before and after people indicated they were experiencing that emotion. Then those tweets were subjected to a sentiment analysis tool. This is, again, where the computers actually read these tweets and then determine whether those tweets were indicative of a positive or a negative mood, which then allowed us to chart the course of the individual's emotions before and after they reported explicitly that they were having an emotion. Right? Of course, this presumes that there's any effect. So if I say, for example, at time t, I give an indication that I'm feeling very happy, that doesn't mean that the tweets that I post 5 minutes before or 10 minutes before are any happier or any more negative than at that point in time, right? So that's essentially what we're trying to find out here by looking at changes in the mood state of these individuals before and after they explicitly report experiencing a mood. And so I won't go into the methods too much here, except that we looked at these what we call affect labeling tweets. Tweets that literally posted, I'm feeling, and then good, happy, great, and awesome, or negative, bad, unhappy, sad, terrible, horrible, and awful. People really do post those kind of tweets. We found 110,000 individuals, which is a sizable sample. Again, think of the scale compared to regular sort of psychological research. 110,000 individuals, of which 67,000, which is already somewhat of an indication that, you know, Twitter is in this sort of happy space that we all want to believe it is. So 67,000 individuals of those 110,000 indicated experiencing a negative emotion, 42,000 indicated experiencing a positive emotion. And again, what we then did, we looked at the 6 hours before and the 6 hours after they posted that tweet, and we analyzed the tweets that they posted in that interval, right? And we analyzed those tweets by the minute in terms of the time span before and after they posted that affect labeling tweet. And then we used the Vader tool, which is a sentiment analysis tool that analyzes the tweet, but also takes into account negation, like I am not happy, everything sucks, you know, those kind of things. It even looks at emojis, exclamation points, etc. So typical online vernacular, and then makes an assessment of the valence of that tweet. And so here's what we found. And so this is one of the first results, I think, where we're able to actually chart the fluctuations of naturally occurring, not an induced, not a sort of not an induced emotion at the minute scale. So you can see on the left-hand side, this is how we measured the fluctuations of a positive emotion as it was experienced and as it was sort of affecting the valence of the tweets that were posted before and after. You see like a sort of a sharp run-up towards the time at which someone reported having a positive emotion, and then a very quick decline back to the baseline right after people indicated that they were having a positive emotion. For the negative emotion, you can see like a slow ramp down that accelerates to sort of a nadir at 0 hour, which is the point in time where someone said that they were having a negative emotion, and then a very quick recovery almost immediately after. And that's sort of part of a little bit of a good news story about social media use and people talking about their emotions, because what this indicates is that a naturally occurring human emotion only lasts for about an hour or so, judging from the changes in the tweets. And the negative emotion also lasts about an hour, but is very quickly resolved when people actually express it online. So these results indicate that it's very useful to go on Twitter and let people know that you're having a negative emotion, because this is a known phenomenon in psychology, that giving putting your emotions into words, a few words, not too many, actually helps to reduce the emotion. And that's what we're seeing in these results as well. We're seeing that the affect labeling actually helps people return to sort of a baseline very quickly in the case of the negative emotions in particular. So that's good news. Again, if you're having an emotion, just sit tight. Within an hour, you'll be back to your baseline. If you want to rush the process along a little bit, it really helps to tell people how you're feeling. So that's good. This also allows us to, of course, to model how these emotions fluctuate over time. And if you look at in the case of the negative emotion, there's some really interesting oscillations on that path, on that descent toward the nadir, where someone became aware of or reported having a negative emotion. But again, it's really interesting to see that when you express a negative emotion in a few words, very quickly people return to the baseline. So it's a very easy technique for emotional regulation that works very, very well and has also been proven out in other research. Well, that's interesting because that means that we can track the individual emotional state of millions of individuals, but of course we can also do that in the aggregate, for example, during a global pandemic. So here's an example of some work that we did where we looked at 20 US cities. The brown zones on the graph are when lockdowns were introduced, and you can clearly see the devastating effect of those lockdowns on the collective emotional state of individuals in these 20 US cities. I want to call out that you have to be very careful in how you conduct this kind of sentiment analysis. Because if we looked only at tweets that specifically mentioned COVID-19, then the results of our analysis would have indicated that people were happier because of COVID-19 and in particular because of the lockdowns. Why? Because in typical American fashion, people would be posting a tweet and something like, yeah, we can do this, everybody, let's beat the virus, which is an expression of a positive emotion, right? And so if you analyze only those tweets, you would come to the wrong conclusion that people are really happy about COVID-19 and the lockdowns. They're not. If you actually look at the tweets that don't mention COVID-19 of the same individuals in the same 20 cities, you'll see a very sharp decline from that baseline during these lockdowns, which indicates that these lockdowns were quite detrimental to sort of the public well-being. In fact, another research we showed that this effect is stronger for cities that have higher percentages of minorities. So these lockdowns actually led to sort of very inequitable outcomes in terms of public well-being. Okay, great. So, but you're probably thinking, I started this talk off by discussing the mental health status of our youth and how social media might be implicated in this. And so that of course calls for sort of a direct investigation of whether we can actually detect mood disorders or internalizing disorders, as we call them, for social media users from their affective dynamics, as I've just demonstrated. And that's something that we set out to do as well. I'm very happy, by the way, that the previous talk did a fantastic job of explaining sort of this notion of these complex systems and the equilibria that they can find themselves in, and this sort of these landscapes of equilibria where these systems might be positioned in a stable basis of attraction, right? Where when they're disturbed, they have very high resilience. They return very quickly back to that set point, right? But when that landscape flattens out a little bit, then the system becomes more precarious, becomes less resilient. And just a little tip could easily push it into another basis of attraction, which could be quite pathological and quite dangerous. And so Martin Scheffer and Van der Limpert, close collaborators of mine at the University of Wageningen, have actually used this type of analysis to study the fluctuations in the emotional state of people suffering from depression. And the interesting thing is that if depression is a critical transition in the mood state of an individual, where their emotional equilibrium undergoes a critical transition towards another equilibrium state that is pathological, then it may be possible to detect the early warning signals for that critical transition. Because a system that is faced with sort of a flattening out of that landscape, right, will move slower. This is comparable to me when I stand on one leg, right, make lots of really quick fluctuations around that set point to keep myself upright on one leg, right? But let's just say I've had a few too many, been drinking a few beers, a little tired, right, and I might be about to fall over, then I might start to sway more slowly. Right? And that's detectable. You can detect that in the autocorrelation and the variance of the system the system state over time. And so that might allow us to look at the fluctuations in the mood state of people that are about to make a transition to a depressed state, and effectively have an early warning signal for the onset of depression. The problem with depression is, and then again, I was really happy that this was mentioned in the previous presentation, is that if this model applies to depression, it might also explain why it's so difficult to escape from a depressed state. We have good treatments for depression and anxiety that are quite reliable, but it takes a lot of effort once the system has actually dropped into that pathological state to get it back up to where it was before. Might even be impossible. And so that's why prevention is critical, and that's why these early warning signals are so important. And so what we did is we actually looked at Twitter users that, I mean, this happens, people do this for real. They go on Twitter and essentially, you know, post a tweet, something like, I went to the doctor, turns out I've got major depression. Some people even post their prescription notes on Twitter. This happens, you know, I mean, this is public data, publicly available data that we can analyze and we can detect. And so in this analysis, what we did is we looked specifically for people on Twitter that instead of saying I feel bad or feel good, they said my doctor diagnosed me with depression. I went to the doctor and the doctor says I've got depression. And so once we detected that someone posted something like this, we downloaded all of their tweets. We harvested the individual's timeline, which meant that we could analyze their emotional state as it fluctuated from time step to time step in relation to the point in time at which they reported a diagnosis of depression. And that's very interesting because now we have these time series of their emotional state, and we can start to look for the early warning signals of the onset of the depression, namely whether the time series is exhibiting greater variance and higher autocorrelation over time, right before they drop into that pathological equilibrium. You might wonder, can we detect depression in online language? Yes, this has been demonstrated extensively. Actually, Eichstadt published in 2018, a year before the COVID-19 pandemic, published this fabulous paper where they actually showed that yes, you can actually train a machine learning, a classifier that looks at the language of individuals on Facebook in this case, not Twitter, and it can actually predict their depression when you condition it on their medical records and actual official diagnosis. But Munmun de Chudru actually did quite a bit of research using the same method as we did, where you look on Twitter, when someone says, I went to the doctor says I've got depression, and then you look at the language of these individuals over time, and you can train a classifier to predict whether or not they're depressed versus a control group. We did the same thing. Actually, a random forest classifier worked really well. We simply took the 300 best features, so the features are terms in this case, and that allowed a classifier with very high accuracy, suspiciously high accuracy, by the way, to predict whether someone was depressed or not. And so we looked at a few of the features that seem to have the highest predictive value, and as you can see, non-depressed individuals love meat and sex, and they also like laughing emojis. So those are features of people who are not depressed. Depressed individuals, on the other hand, as you can see, there's quite of course, we removed the tweets that specifically mention depression, but you can see that this is, these features have a lot of face validity, so to speak. That opens the really interesting possibility that we could be scanning the public Twitter feeds for millions of individuals and apply these classifiers to detect whether or not these individuals are either in danger of developing depression or have actually already developed depression. So that's a really interesting possibility. I should make a word of caution here, and the other researchers have warned about this as well, and I'm fully aware of this. Twitter is not the world's population. I mean, Twitter has about 400 million users. They may be quite atypical, and we're looking at a very small subset of those Twitter users that are depressed and that then reported a diagnosis on Twitter, etc. So I really have to warn a little bit that these data may not be fully representative. And we've seen recently some very interesting failures. And Luc Steels yesterday actually discussed this a little bit as well. These classifiers sometimes are very brittle. They tend to generalize poorly to data that I haven't seen before. For example, this is a use of neural networks to perform COVID-19 detection in chest X-rays, and when presented with pictures of cats, the results were a little disastrous. So the classifier did not generalize well beyond the X-rays that it had been trained on. And that's dangerous. For example, here's another image recognition software that is capable of recognizing a Granny Schmidt apple. If you stick a note on it that says iPod, then it might be confused for an iPod by the same algorithm. So these algorithms don't have a lot of common sense, and so you have to be a little worried that in the case of detecting depression from social media feeds, they might be equally brittle. But that said, there's good reason to believe that this can be done. Okay, this is a little bit of a joke, but apparently a pigeon will also outperform some AI algorithms in detecting breast cancer in nanograms. Because they've got very good vision. Okay, but anyway, could we do this? Yes, I think we can. I mean, we've actually looked at individual timelines. Here's an example of an individual posting where we analyze the mood indicators from their tweets. And you can clearly, this is in the case of bipolar disorder, by the way, and you can clearly see some very sharp transitions happening when the individual goes into a manic versus a depressed state. And from the parameters of these time series, you may be able to predict, not only detect, but also predict when they're about to have a transition to this particular state. Am I running out of time? Slightly. Okay. Okay, so just give me one more minute because I wanted to show you something which will really scare you, okay? Okay, good. So I'm going to move. So we can do this for millions of individuals, and we have, and the results have been quite promising. So we're hoping that we can make a contribution to not just the diagnostics, but also the detection of mental health disorders on social media. Okay, but last part, and just a few more slides, and I've abused your attention so far. Now, many of you might have actually been in a situation where you need to see a therapist for an internalizing disorder such as the depression. The golden standard for treatment right now is cognitive behavioral therapy. Cognitive behavioral therapy is based on this notion that I mentioned before, that this is called the cognitive triad, where our feelings shape our behavior and our thoughts shape our feelings and behavior, etc. So it's an interaction between these three components. Cognitive behavioral therapy spends a lot of time examining the thoughts that are implicated in the development and the onset and the maintenance of the depressed state. These thoughts very often are characterized by cognitive distortions, modes of thinking that are exaggerated, wrong, and overly negative with respect to oneself and the world. I could give you an example. Here's a few, for example, the evening will be a disaster. Like someone who's depressed might say something like, I won't go to the party because all of my friends hate me and I will have a bad time, it will be a disaster, and I'll go home crying, or something like that. You know, most of the time that means they won't go to the party, they won't get the positive reinforcement from their friends, right? So these thoughts have an actual effect on the behavior and motivation. Here's another example, no one will ever like me. So there's a distinct number of types that are distinguished in cognitive behavioral therapy. Of course, the first thing to do is, can we detect these in Twitter language? Can we detect these modes of thinking that are implicated in the development of the depression according to cognitive behavioral therapy in tweets? And so we we composed a lexicon of what we call cognitive distortion schemata, which are sort of 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 grams that we can detect in tweets and that are markers of distorted thinking, of these cognitive distortions. There's 200, I saw someone trying to count them, there's 241 of these. And so, okay, so we look at we can now look at whether, you know, our depressed people on Twitter actually exhibit more of these markers than non-depressed people. So we did this for a random sample of about 10,000 individuals, 8,791 in a matched control group, a random sample, and 1,207 individuals in the depressed group. And what we found is, indeed, this is a long-standing hypothesis of cognitive behavioral therapy. The depressed individuals do actually exhibit very strongly the markers of distorted thinking. So the kind of sort of dichotomous, exaggerated, negative thinking that characterizes the depressed state. And that's really interesting because that means that in addition to the cognitive indicators of these internalizing disorders, the affective indicators, we can now also indicate the style of thinking that might be involved in depression. Okay, I'm rushing, so especially, by the way, personalizing and emotional reasoning. But I feel that it was a bad party, but I feel it wasn't good, even though it was good. So these are very prevalent. They're 2.5 times more prevalent in the depressed group versus the control group, in fact. But okay, so I'm rushing through this a little bit because I wanted to show you one thing. We just published this. I'll skip this as well. I apologize, I have too many slides. This is a paper we just published a year and a half ago in PNAS. And so what we did is we looked at Google Books. So this is English literature since the 1900s to the modern day, 2022. And for every year, we looked at the content of these books published, and we looked for the same markers of cognitive distortions. What are these markers? They don't mention negative emotions. They don't mention depression. IMA, that's a labeling. Will never, catastrophic thinking. Yeah? And so what we found is, watch Germany, by the way. That's the green line. You see sort of an increase right before the Second World War, and then a big spike during the Second World War and right after, right? And then a return back to a baseline. For English, this is American English, so this applies to the US, we see a decline from 1900 to about the 1980s, where the markers of cognitive distortions in English, as it was written down in English literature, declined over time. But look what happens in the 1980s. It's like a hockey stick graph. You can clearly see a huge surge. This is like almost 2.5 standard deviations above the historical baseline of an increase of these cognitive distortions in 14 million books over 125 years. This is, I don't know what to think of this. Has our language become more conducive to the style of thinking, the mode of thinking that is implicated in the onset and the genesis of internalizing disorders such as depression and anxiety? It's not clear, but it is telling that some language shift occurred, and that language shift does match what we think we know about the language of individuals with depression and cognitive distortions. And now my question to you is why? What's going on? What happened in the 1980s that we're seeing such a spike, 2 standard deviations above the historical mean of these cognitive distortions in languages? This applies to both German as well as Spanish. So this is a worldwide phenomenon. You can observe it across multiple cultures. I have to apologize to this audience. I haven't done it for French yet. French is a difficult case because of the double negation. The ne pas makes it really difficult to detect these cognitive distortions in language. So French was not included here, but if there's any suggestions on how to do this, I'd love to hear from you. Anyway, here's some papers that show some more details about what I've been talking about. I want to sort of conclude my talk by saying that we live in a very precarious time, I think. We are not well. I think there's lots of indicators that our societies are increasingly under pressure. The stress levels are higher. The prevalence of internalizing disorders has increased among our youth to levels that I think are quite intolerable for a civilized society. We are besieged by the new communication technology, which may have various effects on our well-being and our ability to think, to feel, to communicate, to relate. And at the same time, we're having these amazing data at our disposition by virtue of the same environments that may be inducing these effects that will allow us to develop a much finer and much better understanding of the human psyche and what constitutes or the factors that drive well-being at a scale that essentially pertains to the entire global population. So I'll end here. I apologize for going over time, but I'd be willing to take questions and discuss further. Thank you.
Thank you, Johan, for this fascinating attempt to make sense of a very complex situation. Well, 2 remarks. The first one, thank you, because now I understand why all my friends are happier, more popular than me, yes. And so I'm not complex anymore. It's not only me. I thought it was only me. You are wonderful. And in fact, your talk reminded me of the old joke about the weather. They say, everybody is talking about the weather, but nobody is doing anything about it. You're talking about the social media. They make us very unhappy. In fact, what can we do about it? Should we ban it? No, we can't. What can we do about it?
I mean, most of this is observational, and what can we do about it? I mean, this is one of those wicked problems, and we talked about climate before, right? And so it's not just a complex problem; it's a wicked problem. I mean, these are for-profit environments. These are some of the richest companies in the world. They make their money by grabbing our attention, by any means possible. And the way they set up their business model is to implement these social networks, which we know to have these kind of effects. So what can we do about it? I mean, we believe in free enterprise, so people are perfectly, the corporations are allowed to monetize these effects. But what can we do about it if it's, I mean, I compare this, I mean, some people have compared this, and I think that that's not a horrible comparison, to smoking. I mean, I grew up in the 80s and 90s.
Bad habit, very bad habit.
It's a very bad habit, but it's also really disgusting. And so I have very little sympathy for it, but growing up in the 80s and 90s, smoking was everywhere. It was really difficult to ban it. It was really difficult to control it because the tobacco companies made their money by selling an addictive product that was damaging to our health. And so I think we're in a similar situation right now. So what to do about it? I mean, could we ban social media? I personally think we should restrict it to the greatest degree possible, and potentially even nationalizing some of these platforms. Sorry, there, I said it. Sometimes, you know.
Well, you heard it here first. It's kind of a French solution to a problem. Let's nationalize the whole thing, and maybe we'll
Well, I'm happy to oblige.
Well, but there are also sometimes just individual solutions. Me personally, I'm not a member of any social media. I've never been a member of any social media. So there could be some individual solution. Anyway.
I deleted all of my social media accounts in 2016.
Wonderful.
Except Instagram, where I promote my DJ business. So.
Well, you have one social media more than me anyway. Thank you very much.